Today's video will describe how to use a design description as a design tool. Hello, I'm James Helfrich. The traditional use of a design description is to communicate design ideas to another stakeholder, typically a third party who will then build the application that you designed. However, design descriptions are also very useful as a design tool to help you formulate your ideas and to drill down on more detailed items. This video will explain that process. For some, creating a design description, often consisting of hundreds of pages, seems like a daunting task. Questions such as where does one begin and why can't I just write the code come to mind. However, a simple 5-step methodology makes it possible to design pretty much any application, regardless of its size, scope, or complexity. So step number 1 is the front matter. We want to understand exactly what we're building and how this design relates to others. Step number 2, we want to create a design representation of view 1. What's the overall system view? And once we come up with this design representation, next we want to come up with the design information. We need to identify the subcomponents that will be defined later. Next, following a top-down design, we need to design the subsequent views. And these views get smaller and smaller and more specific as we progress through the design process. Finally finished, we want to manage all this into a large document. So let's take a look at this 5-step process in more detail. So step number 1. Before one begins any project, large or small, one needs to understand the scope and what is needed. Having clarity on this is critical. You'd be surprised how many projects, large and small, get derailed because the various members of the team do not have an agreement or a shared understanding of what we're supposed to do. Many skip this step, thinking they know the project well enough, only later to discover that there is a misconception or a misunderstanding. Taking a few minutes to write down your understanding of the project can clarify things and reduce the opportunity for mistakes. A few key questions include, number 1, what is to be built? This is for the scope part of the front matter. Certainly you and all members of the design team have to have a shared understanding of what exactly is the system. If any member of the design team has a misunderstanding or a different idea, then the opportunity for confusion or wasted effort is absolutely possible. Writing down this shared understanding is a critical step. In the business, we would call this a mission statement. Next, we want to list who's on the design team, and this is the authorship part of the front matter. And when new members of the design team join, then it's really helpful for them to know exactly who they can talk to for help. What are the other related technologies or projects? And as we discover technology and project dependencies, we should write these down to make sure we have a complete list of all known dependencies. Now, when we start the project, we're not going to have a complete list, but this list will grow as the project develops so we understand the project better. And finally, who are the stakeholders? The stakeholders include not only the person who pays for the project, namely the client, but the users and other technologies and even the design team themselves. Now, step 2, the first design representation. Initially, design descriptions are created using a top-down strategy. One starts with the most general view of the entire system and gradually works to more detailed and specific ones. So here's an example of a component diagram that has 2 clients, a mobile client and a web portal, and a server. The server has the business logic as well as the database. And this is the overall blueprint to the design. Now notice the first design representation could be very general, just like this one, or it could consist of dozens and dozens of components. It's really up to the design team to figure out how detailed this first view must be. But we cannot break the large project into smaller ones and give one team stewardship over database and one over web portal, whatever, until we understand what the overall system view looks like. Usually all members of the design team contribute to this initial view. And every member of the design team should fully understand and have buy-in to the first several views. Usually we use a component diagram for the view number 1, but some people prefer to use a data flow diagram. It's really up to you. Now, notice here we have several interfaces. We have one between the business logic and mobile client. We have one between the business logic and the web portal, and we have one between the database and the business logic. All these high-level interfaces need to be carefully negotiated with all members of the design team. Now, once the first view is drawn, the next step is to fill out a table associated with the view. This table, called the design information, represents all that is known about the view. The most important part of this table is the list of elements, in this case, mobile client, web portal, business logic, database, and server. So here's an example of a typical table. Now, your organization may have more or less. First of all, we want to name the view and describe its purpose and give a 1 or 2 sentence description. Next, it's a really good idea to list all the requirements or user stories that relate to this particular view. Now, all the elements in a design representation are listed, and sometimes we can describe them with a sentence, and that's enough, but more often than not, we got to give it a label for a subview, which we'll elaborate on that. Now, just imagine that there are, let's say, 30 or 40 different views in your application, and you pick up a random view in the middle of it. What do you need to know to understand this view? Well, you've got to kind of understand how this view relates to the big picture, and that's the reference by row. You got to understand how I could drill down to learn more information. That's the elements row. You got to figure out how this relates to what we're trying to build. The requirements help. But personally, I always look at the purpose and the description part to get my base level understanding of what this view represents. The goal is that when I'm finished with my design information, I should have no unanswered questions. Now, step 4 is to go through all the subsequent views. At any point in the design process, we can elaborate on an aspect of the design by turning one element into a view of its own. As this is done, it is necessary to choose an appropriate viewpoint to describe that design idea and work out different design alternatives and explain the elements of the new view as clearly as possible. One can think of a design description as a tree. At the root is view 1, representing the entirety of the design, though at a very high level, and branching from view 1 are all the views that it directly represents. Thus, one can follow a series of branches from view 1 down to every other view in the entire document. So I'm going to start with view number 1, the overall system view. And this guy, for an example, let's say that I have 3 subviews, 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. Now, I suspect that each of these subviews is also so general that I cannot yet write code. So I'm going to need to elaborate. In this case, I'm going to elaborate on view 1.1, but I'm going to have to do the same thing for 1.2 and 1.3. Now, notice how my numbering system is very consistent. 1.1.1 is clearly a child of 1.1, which is clearly a child of 1. So now view 1.1 is going to have 3 child views. Usually it's going to have more than that. Now, I want to elaborate a little more on 1.1.3, so I'm going to dive into that one a little bit more. And once again, notice how my numbering system is ruthlessly consistent. It kind of describes exactly where it belongs in the tree just by the numbers. And then I want to elaborate on 1.1.3.2. Now, usually a single view is not going to have 3, but let's say a dozen subviews. And you're probably going to have 6, maybe 7 different levels of views to describe a reasonably complex document. Now, if your project is small, let's say 10,000 lines of code, then you could probably get away with a dozen views, maybe 2 or 3 levels of views. However, most projects are much bigger than that. Most projects are measured in tens of millions of lines of code. And there are 6, maybe 7 levels where each level is going to have maybe a dozen subviews correspond to a given parent view is usually more common. Now, as you can imagine, organizing all these views can be quite difficult. Sometimes each of these views is in its own document and you have to hyperlink them together. So you have to have some sort of plan to do that. Other times we stick it into one single physical document. And once again, you have to manage that. But in all cases, there needs to be a way to navigate between the views. We need to be able to drill down and loop back up, as well as find all the subviews correspond to a given view super easy. So one tip is use a multi-level numbering system to name views, like I did 1.1.1, 1.1.2, and so on. Place each view on its own page. And what exactly is a page? Could be a web page or it could be a physical printed page. Whatever the case, a typical user should have one screen of data which completely represents that view of the system. If a view captures too much and then it can't fit on a page, it's probably going to be more human readable by breaking that large view up into smaller ones. And finally, use headings and links intentionally. Be ruthlessly consistent about your naming conventions. You can learn more about creating the design description in the Creating the Design Description section of the Design Description chapter of the Software Design textbook.